27 вересня.
The 27th of September, Media Center Ukrinform is working. My name is Svetlana Necheparenko, and we continue speaking about the crimes committed by the occupiers in our land, how they torture, kidnap, and abduct our people, and in particular, now we are going to speak about attacks on local self-government. Human rights activists will tell us who has been kidnapped by the Russians from the local government. This is part of the Media Center Hub main platform. Let me introduce our participants. Borys Petruniok, researcher and documenter at ZMINA Center for Human Rights. Olga Babich, the wife of the kidnapped mayor of Golopristan town, Alexander Babich. Mykola Sikalenko, a victim of a violent kidnapping, head of the Tsirkunivsk village military administration. Yevgeny Sira and Olena Sira, relatives of the kidnapped headman of the village, Novy Borovichi. Anatoly Siri and Alexander Slobozhan, Executive Director of the Association of Cities and Towns of Ukraine. Mr. Borys, I would like to start our conversation with you. What is known about these violent abductions of the head of local authorities? What facts have been documented by your organization? Good afternoon, dear colleagues. My name is Borys Petruniok. I'm researcher and analyst at ZMINA Center for Human Rights. As you know about ZMINA, as part of the coalition of the 5 o'clock, we continue documenting abductions as well as, unfortunately, tortures of civilians in the temporarily occupied territories. Unfortunately, we came to understand that the leaders of local governments are some of the representatives of the most vulnerable population persecuted by the occupiers. As of now, we know about more than 130 such cases of violent detentions, abductions, or keeping people prisoner. As you can see it from the slide, we can see it by regions. The greatest number of such regions is in Kherson region, also in Zaporizhia and Kharkiv regions. But let me draw your attention to the fact that this is a general picture brought to your notice. However, we may still be not aware about the whole number of these arbitrary detentions amongst the leaders of the local governments, because this has been a very commonplace practice, and we talk about different kinds of violations in terms of even abducting people or detaining them for a couple of hours all the way to several days. In fact, given what I have already said, according to our information, about 3/4 of the people detained have been released. However, along with that, we speak in favor of the fact that detentions may have taken place at different times and for different periods, for different duration. And the situation is as follows. The majority of people detained, the shorter was the time of their detention, the higher were the chances of them being released. So duration here plays a significant role. And a great number of such cases were documented in the first months of the occupation, as you can see it on the slide, in March and April 2022. Later on, unfortunate practice continued, and we still say that part of the occupied territories has been released, and these kinds of practices have been brought to a stop. And why do Russians try to do it? When we speak about detentions, confinements, violent abductions, taking civilians as prisoner, in particular the heads of local governments, local administrations, for the occupation, they're the source of information about the community, about the population, about the government authorities, about the infrastructure, army, communal system, etc., and so on and so forth. So basically, Russians, from the documents and the interviews that we have held, they would come and they would ask, who is in charge? This was the first question posed in Kiev region and in other regions of Ukraine. So representatives of local governments were immediately under pressure and faced the risk of violence, being detained, and other such things. We also say that local self-government representatives carry a lot of social capital with them. They have a lot of connections in the communities, with the local businesses, with the representatives of law enforcement agencies, etc. So this is another resource for the occupation authorities. And most importantly, representatives of local self-government are legitimate carriers of the right to exercise power, because they have been elected in these communities or appointed to these posts and in these roles before hostilities. Therefore, for the occupational authorities, they are a threat and a valuable source. And this is the perspective from which we have to consider these activities to force them into collaboration. Therefore, in summary, we must not consider these cases as sporadic or indiscriminate, because these are the attacks of the occupational authorities on local communities or local institutional authorities, connectivity between the people. And the Russian authorities, the Russian Federation, pursue in this way their own global goals of exerting control over these territories. Mr. Borys, have you seen any irregularities concerning why some of these representatives of local government were released and others would still be in prison? The situations may vary from region to region, as we have been able to see a great number of local self-government, of course, the heads of or mayors of villages and towns in certain regions who were detained. These may have also been local council representatives or representatives of some units or departments within local authorities that were of provisional value for the occupiers. So basically, we have to say that not a single civilian in the occupied territory is safe or secured against such instances of violence. So we are focusing only on the categories, certain categories of the civilians, in order to understand and deduct their logic. But the idea is that, once again, any civilian is faced with the risk of being taken prisoner and being tortured or violated against or abused. Thank you. According to the numbers that you are saying to us, real stories. And let us hear from some of the people who have been captive. Ms. Olga, Madam Olga, your husband is still kept prisoner. The enemy had kidnapped him some time ago. And what do you know about the details of this abduction? As of now, we don't know much. Regrettably, the people who were released, the people who were prisoners of war and may have been together in the same chamber or in the next rooms next to my husband, they got in touch with me and they informed me about some information. Right now, he's in the city of Simferopol in the detention unit number 2. Before that, he had been in another detention unit in Simferopol, but in November last year, the majority of these people detained, like my husband, were moved to a special pretrial detention center. It had been specially refurbished, and right now he's staying in this detention center number 2 in the city of Simferopol. How long has been a prisoner, and how did he get there? He has been prisoner since 28th of March 2022. Since the beginning of the war, when the occupation began, the occupiers came into our town, occupied it in the first days of the war, but they tried to remain within the forest strips. There were some checkpoints, and the town actually, would still continue living its normal life, and we were very much hopeful that nobody would attack us, because this trouble had never occurred to us. We were still believers that they would see that the people were patriotic. We would organize different kinds of meetings and rallies in favor of Ukraine. The majority of people were still proponents of Ukraine. People were not afraid. They were always ready to articulate their pro-Ukrainian stance. And we were very much hopeful that it wouldn't last, that somehow our troops, our army would come and liberate us. But the situation, unfortunately, went in contravention to our expectations. And during that period of time, we lived our normal lives. People were confused, baffled, very much anxious. because in the whole territorial community, we didn't have many representatives of authorities. We didn't have police officers or any militants that could somehow put up resistance for us. All of the people were looking forward to some rescue to come from the heads of the local administrations, people who were still holding on to some of the ministerial positions. Humanitarian aid was being delivered. The town and our region, you see, geographically wise, is kind of blocked. Therefore, all of the food stuffs hadn't been brought into our region since the commencement of hostilities, and the city mayor, the town mayor, was trying to arrange for food supplies, bread, flour supplies. In the first days of the war, unfortunately, we had exhausted all of the supplies of that. So the supplies were only delivered from Kherson, and as you know, Kherson was also occupied in the first days of the hostilities. So this was something that we were busy dealing with. Also, we didn't have any representatives of the police and people, some people, local residents, you know, like they say, it's no good wind that brings no gain, even in time of war. So some such people started to gain their own interests. Therefore, local residents were keeping guard and watch of law and order. And this is how we were trying to continue living and working, trying to support the locals, because there was just one individual that everyone was looking up to and expecting help and assistance to come to them. And he couldn't fail them. This was my husband. That's why every day he would go around his territorial community. He would just show his driving license. Nobody knew that he was a town council head. He would go around all of the headmen or the elders in the local settlements, speaking to the local population. Thank you, Madam Olga. Mr. Mykola, you lived through the occupation. Could you kindly share your story with us of the things that you have seen and survived? Our village of Tsirkunivsk is 25 kilometers from the border with the Russian Federation, and we were occupied. At 7 o'clock in the morning, at 8 o'clock, they were already traversing the territory of our local community. It happened very quickly. By the way, there was a very good battle at the crossroads. This battle put up a lot of resistance before they receded. For a week it was peaceful and quiet. Then the Russian Guard, Rosgvardia, came in. Then they exited, and then LDNR, Lugansk People's Republic representatives came in, and they began to rob the local population, first at night, and then they would do it by daylight. They would just come to the houses trying to loot the empty houses of their property. I was detained 3 times. The last time it was on the first time it was on the 3rd of March, then on the 21st of March. They detained me for a week, and then they let me go. Then the Russian troops withdrew, then they came back. I think about the 1st of April they came, and once again they detained me the 3rd time, and it was again for 1 day. They wanted me to collaborate all of the 3 times. A line, establish work, you are the head of the local community, so collaborate, cooperate with it. I said, I am the head of the administration, but not under your authorities. Then they tried to freeze me for a week, kept me without food. They would give some water, but kept me without food in freezing chambers, sub-zero temperatures, just to encourage me to become more subservient, more obedient, but they failed. So this is my brief story. Thank you for sharing that. Madam Olena and Mr. Yevgen, you are relatives of the kidnapped headman Anatoly, Siri, could you kindly share your story with us? What I can say is that it's in Chernigiv region where we come from. The man that is our relative has always commanded a lot of authority and very much and highly respected by the residents of the local village, by the pupils of the local village, because he is also a teacher of the local village school. So when this full-scale invasion started, and our village is nearby the border with Belarus and the Russian Federation, so people woke up early in the morning because they had heard a war, not from the news, but they had heard it with their own ears. And of course, my father, Siri Anatoly, assumed all responsibility because he's always been like that. He's highly responsible, and he assumed responsibility for ensuring welfare of his fellow villagers. First of all, this related to food supplies, because in fact, from the first hours, the village turned out to be encircled. The military went through another village, and our village was a little bit aside, but anyway, there was no connection with mainland Ukraine at the time. In order to find some medication in our village, he would also go and look around the houses, because we had a great number of senior people in our village, so he took care of them. We found some flour, some bread, and we spread it. Sometimes half a loaf of bread, sometimes a third of the loaf of bread would go to one family. Because the authorities had left, well, maybe not had left, but there were no policemen around. So he had to organize patrolling of the village to avoid looting. And he organized the local men in the village and blokes just to make sure that there were checkpoints behind some trees. And in fact, I was not a witness to that, because at that time I was staying in Kiev. I think my mom can tell you more about what was going on back in the day. But from our telephone conversations, he lived the problems of the village 24/7. Sometimes he would stay away from home nearly 24 hours just to try to establish the best favorable conditions for his fellow villagers. Madam Olena, could you kindly continue with the story? Yes, let me add, because for a while I stayed together with my husband in the village. My son has already told you that my husband commands a lot of authority. It's not because this is my son and this is my husband, but he's a very well-known man and very decent man at that. We heard the war start. At 5 o'clock in the morning, we could already see guns shooting, and my husband immediately went to the local council. The communication was very difficult to establish with the authorities because everyone had left. What kind of mode of behavior to assume? Nobody could answer this question, so he took it at his own liberty, because local authorities were not helping in any way. The son has just explained it to you how it was working. So my husband was in charge of tackling all of the problems for fellow villagers. People had no money, no medicine, no food. Burying the dead. Unfortunately, people never ask you when to die, so getting the coffin, you would have to go through the Russian checkpoints. This was extremely dangerous, depending on the moods that these Russian checkpoint controllers had. You might stay alive or not. So the civil position that my husband assumed was very clear, and he was run by the moods and sentiments of the local villagers. Everyone was ready to resist the occupying authorities, and I suppose on the 28th of February, let's put it this way, we had the system of signal lights between the villages in place, and a signal had come to us that Russian heavy machinery and vehicles would be going through your village. And my husband immediately mobilized everyone, and at the end of the village, people immediately began to build blocks in order to resist this machinery from going through our village. And he wasn't telling me anything of that because he was trying probably to protect and save me. But from my balcony, I saw my men trying to resist an armored vehicle, and this armored vehicle nearly ran over him. But the Russians managed to move through. My husband managed to stop their patrol carrier. Some piece of equipment was thrown under the wheels, and there was a traffic accident. And part of this equipment, military equipment, got lost because my husband had also made sure that the road signs had been removed. And he began to explain to them that you are occupiers, this is not your place, you're not supposed to be here. And he persuaded them. He spoke to the commander. They were angry with him, he was angry with them, and eventually he managed to convince them, and they moved to another village on the border between Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. That was it. That was the end of that situation. I virtually saw him not at home. He was always staying busy. He was always sorely needed by people. And then on March 29th, a jeep came into our village of the Russian occupiers. They started looking for the elder man. My husband was outside the local office, and the guys from the local checkpoint gave him a telephone call. And they said, hide, because they are pursuing you. And my husband said, I'm not going to hide. He was in a car together with his friend, but his friend said, come on, let me take you out of the village. Just wait up. Wait and see. And he said instead, no, go, take me there, I'll be talking to them. So my husband was busy dealing with his things, and suddenly they opened the door with a kick of their leg. Some of the people were wearing balaclava, some of them were using arms. They were very cynical and brutal, both morally and physically. They began to beat him right there. They blindfolded him with his own jacket. They tied up his hands and started looking for arms. So you understand what kind of treatment he was given to. Then he was taken home. My youngest son was threatened at gunpoint. They took away all of the money, his mobile telephone, all of the documents, and he was taken out of the village. And up until now, I don't know where he for sure is. As of now, we do not know where his whereabouts are. The Russians are not confirming that he is dead or alive. Thank you very much for sharing your story with us. Mr. Alexander, what is the Association of Ukrainian cities and towns doing in order to establish the whereabouts of the representatives of local governments abducted by the occupiers, and in the main place to get them back to Ukraine? Good afternoon, dear colleagues, counterparts. Establishing the whereabouts of the kidnapped individuals is the last but one stage, penultimate stage. Let me instead share with you some things. Since February 24th last year, according to our statistics, which we keep as the Association of Towns and Cities of Ukraine, 59 officials of local authorities of basic level have been kidnapped. We also have some regional and district level information of them. With the help of different tools, we have been able to liberate 51 people as of now, 3 mayors, and Alexander Babich, and the mayor of Kherson Kalakhayev and mayor of Rudny in Zaporizhia region are still kept in detention. And criminal proceedings have been initiated with reference to these cases, and I will dwell on that a bit later to explain why it was necessary to do that in its time and how difficult it was time in terms of our incumbent legislation. 2 headmen or elders of Snovska, Chernigiv region village, and Borominska community representative. I myself was in Bucha at this time with the mayor of the town, and And in fact, during the second week of the occupation, of the full-scale invasion, according to certain orders issued, certain lists of mayors, and not only of acting mayors, but the former mayor of Kherson, Mr. Mykolayenko, is also a prisoner. Local council representatives, activists were all part of these lists. And they began to detain them. Some of these people were kept in detention for several hours, but according to our statistics, some of them were in detention for as long as 3 days. After 3 days passed, then we went on all the way to the presidential administration, the respective ministry, and the headquarters, the Unified Center. That's something that had to be established. Stage 1, it had to be gateway had to be established because we didn't have any gateways or any entry points established at the time. The second point was establishing information intercourse, very valid information. Let me give you just one illustration. I'm not going to name the individual. When one of the mayors, according to our procedure, we had to receive some information from the occupational authorities according to our incumbent legislation. Then amendments to the legislation had to be introduced. And at the time, there were no clear job descriptions for mayors of towns, and our association had to develop this job description. It was approved by the Office of the President, and then via regional military administration, this job description was circulated. At that time, it was just early March. This helped. Since the month of March, detentions en masse started and problems with communication. So this was the fourth super important point that I would like to draw your attention to, because on a weekly basis, we have digests released targeting international structures, because centers here in Ukraine enjoy a very good connection with us, and we have the names of all of the people kept in prison for updating information, making the information relevant in order to confirm their state, because there is part of the officials in the Donetsk region, for example, who are no longer in Ukraine. Next point, super important point, was to hold the Congress of local city and town authorities under the umbrella of the Council of Europe. So we documented the names of these people. They are not supposed to be prisoners of war. So the claims of the international authorities were made in order to change the incumbent order. This is the Committee of the Regions of the European Parliament. In order to document such faces, establish these faces, we had very difficult communication with the Red Cross. I'm not going to comment on that. The representative of the UN office were helping us, and very cautious, in some cases perhaps not quite understandable information awareness campaign, which was aligned with the local authorities as a tool to preserve lives of those people who were kept prisoners. Because you can see it from the visits of international guests coming to Ukraine. Information is usually provided to them or via them as passed to our special services to facilitate the release of these prisoners. And I would like to speak specially about the work of the special intelligence forces. For example, the Human Rights Commissioner of Ukraine, he has had meetings with the Russians, and they spoke about the necessity to have prisoner exchanges, and there were a lot of stoppages caused by the Russian authorities. But after all, we were able to amend the legislation in Ukraine. Why it is important to initiate proceedings? Because we have had some situations when these officials were released, and they were brought to the Ukrainian-controlled territory. They went through the filtration procedure, and what their relatives told, and I can tell it for myself, the mayor office of Bucha, like you can see a hospital building, Russian forces, 9,000 people who have to be provided with evacuation. And you need to introduce some curfew to make sure that people are not shot dead in the streets. And such people like mayors responsible for law and order. My last communication with Mr. Alexander Babic, because he was a member of the board of the Association of Cities and Towns. That's why I was in touch with him. So those occupied territories still continued their operation. And the only fault of those people was that they were taking care of the interests of their communities. These are flagrant violations of all possible conventions. And such people as the mayor of Nova Kakhovka or others who were moved from the occupied territories to the territory controlled by the Ukrainian government. They were immediately blamed for collaborationism. So initiating proceedings is extremely necessary. With reference to several people, we are already working to work out a resolution by the European Parliament, and recently with the participation of Ivan Semodnyuk, who is deputy mayor of Energodar, who spent more than 200 days in captivity. Some decisions were taken by the Association of the Cities and Towns of Ukraine. Some of these decisions, unfortunately, are closed. They are not meant for being divulged for security reasons. But our security services are in the know about these decisions. So different tools and instruments are being utilized. With reference to some individuals, we even tried to target the church, business, Special Intelligence Service, Human Rights Commissioner, the Red Cross. All of these venues have been utilized, but we don't know what will work in every situation. For some of them, we even had to approach the Pope of Rome. We have to be frank about that. It's very difficult for the Ukrainian official authorities to go through prisoner exchanges. We are extremely limited in this respect, particularly when we talk about civilian exchanges. Everything has been put to a stall right now. But we have already written more than 1,000 letters, like different kinds of notices, certificates, exerting pressure in terms of initiating proceedings. And it's only after some media announcements are made and let us put it this way, this becomes a kind of a provocation to draw general attention to this case. So we introduced changes to the criminal code, to the code about local administrations, about different procedures of the Cabinet of Ministers, different kinds of instructions with the seal of secrecy. So the heroism of the people who had to stay in captivity and who unfortunately are kept prisoner just because they were trying to ensure evacuation and security to the local residents, this cannot be overstated or over-exaggerated. And lastly, every representative of local authorities who at the time was in the occupied territories, why these particular instructions or descriptions of job descriptions were necessary. All of them put their lives on the line. The 13 directors of school in Melitopol, when they write their letters of resignation, just to make sure that they are not considered to be collaborators with the Russian authorities, because our criminal code says that even evacuation, going to work and ensuring that you go back to work was considered an act of collaborationism. All of these things required very prompt changing. So de facto, the work conducted in this area sometimes contravenes our legislation in terms of making sure that these people are released and are not brought to account according to the Ukrainian criminal code to account. Like part of the people in Genichevsk had to resign from their offices, and we had to prove it to the central executive authorities that those people, headmen, local council representatives, mayors, they were symbols of local Ukrainian authorities. They were the most vulnerable because their members of families were kidnapped to force them to make different statements in favor of the occupational authorities. And they didn't have any other opportunity but to resign and flee the occupied territories. Therefore, I wanted to draw the common attention to such things. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Alexander. Dear journalists, are there any questions to ask our guests? Good afternoon, Kachuk Svetlana, Ukrinform. I have two small questions to ask you. Number one being, maybe you can specifically tell us what instructions can be complied with by representatives of local authorities to secure themselves, for them not to be kidnapped or abducted. And the second point that I would like you to explain about, how do international organizations help? How are they helping? Because you have said that these are some of the venues to get our Ukrainian people back. So maybe you can tell us about some of the recent illustrations of your cooperation with these organizations, will you please? Let me give you one of the latest examples. The European Parliament contains several structures, or consists of several structures. There is the European Committee of Regions that deals with local authorities, local self-governments, and for the countries, member states of the EU, there is a respective order for the invincibility of municipalities. Order meaning a medal or an award, and the European Council of Towns and Cities and Regions is a non-governmental organization in a way that unites associations and local self-governments within the EU. So in cooperation with them, we will manage to mitigate the regulation to obtain this award, because it is issued exclusively to municipalities of the member states of the EU. And our international unit had to go through really laborious activities to nominate Alexander Babic for this award. After that, the European Parliament voted in favor of that. But let me explain the logic of these activities. For the central Ukrainian authorities, when we had these tons of letters and communications, we have right now 20,000 prisoners, according to different assessments. There is no other way but preserve and maintain, preserve lives and make sure that people's livelihoods are saved. So if the European Parliament voted in favor of such an award, this becomes a very good thing to rescue these people from captivity. And another point concerning the mayor of Dniprorudne town, statements made with reference to him and then with reference to all officials issued by the Congress of the local authorities under the umbrella of the Council of Europe. It's an international organization, and I don't think it requires any additional representation. They made these statements in the first periods of occupation. We provided the necessary materials, analytics. On a weekly basis, we held the necessary meetings. So this was the second tool to help us. And the third one, in terms of international partnerships, this is the UN. It's a slightly different level, of course, to exert influence. And we are very much hopeful that in the foreseeable future, this will also bring its own results, tangible results, we hope. Good afternoon.
Two questions, or two part of the question.
Just a second, sorry, we'll use translator device.
Я розумів. Добре.
If anyone needs translation, would you kindly take the device for that?
Yes, please.
Dobre. So are the officials treated in the same capacity as all citizens when it comes to the exchanges as far as department? And number two, much like the soldiers who are in captivity are handled for exchanges through the GUR, through the coordination headquarters, what branch in the Ukrainian government is handling the exchanges for civilians and especially for leadership, like the mayors? Дякую.
With reference to detention of the local authorities, local self-government bodies, in some cases, we know that they are kept in solitary confinements or separately from other civilians. These may be, for example, pretrial detention centers, police stations, or specially set up premises. Sometimes they're held together with other prisoners. You know, the occupational authorities pursue one of the goals concerning the representatives of local authorities. In the first place is to isolate them from the members of their communities and perhaps separate them from other prisoners, for them to be not just contained in confinement as civilians are usually kept, but just to hold them and keep them in isolation, in confinement. And isolation is one of these goals that they pursue when they kidnap or abduct them. Concerning the mechanisms, as far as I know, the procedures are in no way different when we talk about civilians and prisoner exchanges. The representatives of authorities which are under illegitimate detention, their families unfortunately go through the same hardships and difficulties as other family members of civilians. These may be educators, these may be activists, these may be representatives of the media. Therefore, the situation is pretty much the same with reference to them. Maybe there are some subtle points concerning every individual case, but this heavily depends on the local authorities, because unfortunately, Russia does not want to confirm whether or not they detain these people in their captivity. Therefore, the Russian Federation, in a certain way, is manipulative of this information, and the family members find out the information about their relatives from some unofficial sources, from people who have been released from prison or captivity, and the institutional authorities in Ukraine are working based on this information. And I think that they work according to the same lines as with reference to other civilians. I mean, the same authorities are engaged in terms of coordinating these processes, documenting the facts, and finding out and finalizing whether or not they are legitimately or illegitimately detained. Thank you. Part of the question was also about the role of the central executive authorities. So, for your understanding, 7 official structures are in place, which are united in a single office. We, as the Association of Citizen Towns, on a weekly basis, for every individual, we provide all of the rationale that this is a violation of every possible convention, that these people are still kept in captivity. So for each of these 7 offices, we maintain our communication with them, and in these letters we indicate that 1,031 municipalities which are united by our association and their management, 67 individuals, are applying to you with the legal demand, and these are official addresses sent to the President of Ukraine. There is a unified headquarters, as you have properly said. And the role that the central authorities have to play in the prisoner exchanges, is significant. Not everything can be made public. I can tell you more. 80% of the information stays backstage. And we think that the central authorities do it very correctly. I spoke about 59 people. With reference to 51 individuals, this has already proved its efficiency. They also have their limited capacity. It's a lot of titanic work. And the way they ensure these prisoner exchanges, this communication, and the way that they forward contact information, it's only by exerting pressure. And I'm sure that all of these individuals eventually will be released from imprisonment, so this unified headquarters continue working. But on a weekly basis, we have to continue doing this work, because this is the requirement of our instructions, of our applicable legislation, and this is the requirement of the legislation that they are guided by. Thank you. Concerning civilian prisoner exchanges, authorities usually convince us that civilians are not going to be swapped in line with the Geneva Conventions. They have to be released unconditionally. What does unconditionally mean? Do we have to wait for them for the rest of our lives until the Russian authorities want to release them unconditionally? I believe that times are changing, challenges are changing, therefore the legislation, legal framework has to be amended, because they're the people who are suffering as much as the military personnel, perhaps even more. Because when they were taken prisoner, they didn't have any arms. Military personnel, when they are taken prisoner, at least they have some guns, they do their job. Of course, they are all heroes without an exception, but when a troop does his or her job, they know that they may be killed, they may be taken prisoner or released. However, a civilian, at the time of their detention, had nothing to protect themselves with, to defend themselves with. And right now, they just have to wait for decision released by the Russian authorities in their favor. But the Russian authorities may be reluctant to release them forever and ever. So will these people have to be held in captivity for the rest of their days? I think that we have to go all the way to the international arena. We have to communicate more with the international partners for them to put pressure and utilize different mechanisms of pressure on the Russian authorities. Maybe some sanctions to slap on them concerning their families. I don't know what is required. For 1.5 years, they have been trying to devise a particular kind of a mechanism. What sort of a mechanism? People are waiting there every single second of their lives, in threatened lives. And they say to us, come up with a mechanism. 1.5 years hasn't been enough to come up with this mechanism. And in all the time, only 140 civilians have been exchanged. And they say that this was just a lucky coincidence. But I beg your pardon. The situation has been brought to a head. We can wait for the rest of our days for their unconditional release. Thank you. We still have some time for one brief question.
Is do we have a list of any countries that have already been cooperating with civilian exchanges? We know that Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey have been involved in military exchanges, but do we have any countries that have been announced or part of civilian releases? Дякую.
In return to our addresses, letters of address, we obtained different kinds of answers and replies that you have to go to two structures, one of them being the UN and the other one the Red Cross. But I'm very much supportive of Mr. Olga. The problem, the conundrum, lies in the fact that the work that we do, this weekly work that we do, perhaps this is hard for you to fathom. These people are not civilian. If we talk about officials of the local self-government authorities, do pay attention to one point. With the commencement of the full-scale invasion, local regional administrations were instantaneously changed for military administrations, which is why every representative of local self-governments, all of these people who are in captivity right now, were authorized to perform the function of the state, of the government. Yes, they were the officials of the local self-governments, but under martial law, they automatically had to fulfill the functions that were not typical of them. Therefore, for me, the priority of their exchange at the level, at the same level as the military exchange calls nothing into question. So they're just as military people, although civilian. So we have to establish an institution of the Ukrainian authorities, and I mean, the institutions in the Ukrainian government have to pay a greater deal of importance to making sure that they're released. And we keep insisting on it in all of our meetings, in all of our letters. And in the nearest future, in the reports of the international structures, I hope it will be reflected as a recommendation issued here in Ukraine. Perhaps in a way, this will shift and move and change the situation. Thank you to our guests. I wish the family members of those people who are still remaining in the Russian captivity to be brought back home as quickly as possible. And we very much hope that all of the culpable persons will be brought to account. And the Media Center of Ukraine, Ukrinform, will continue its operation tomorrow. We are already working on the schedule for tomorrow. Please stay with us. Thank you.